Hello everybody, my name is Ethan McMahon and I will be presenting the topic of Prohibition. In this presentation, I will give a summary of the origins of Prohibition, I will talk about how Prohibition shaped the 1920s, and I will relate Prohibition to the novel The Great Gatsby. So let's start off with defining Prohibition. What is it? Well, before we define Prohibition, we need to talk about the origins of the idea. The idea of Prohibition began with the temperance movements in the 1800s through women's societies. In 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement was formed in the United States, and in Canada in 1875, the Dominion Prohibitory Council was formed but changed to the Dominion Alliance for the Total Suppression of the Liquor Traffic in 1876. Both of these women's temperance societies protested against alcohol consumption to ignite legislative prohibition of alcohol. Both the WCTU and DATSLT, I'm just going to call that DATSLT, societies wanted prohibition on alcohol because alcohol and hard liquors acted as a damping force in marriages and families, and because these women believed that the abolition of alcohol would increase economic success and religious purity. On top of all of this, with the Industrial Revolution in its prime, factory owners and businesses supported prohibition during the turn of the century in order to prevent accidents in the workplace related to alcohol and to increase the efficiency and working hours of their employees if sober. Now, interestingly enough, Canada instituted prohibition in 1878. In Canada, the federal and provincial governments didn't pass a federal or provincial law to prohibit alcohol because prohibition would cause a loss in tax revenue and party support. However, due to the successful protests of DATSLT, the federal government passed the Canada Temperance Act, or Scott Act, as a compromise in 1878. The Scott Act allowed the local governments to pass laws in regards to prohibition of alcohol. In America, however, no prohibition laws were passed during the 19th century. But in World War I, prohibition reached its strongest. In Canada during 1915 and 1916, all provinces but Quebec prohibited the sale of alcohol as a result of a successful campaign by the DATSLT that suggested prohibition would preserve time and money to help the war effort. In the United States during 1917, when they just joined the war, President Woodrow Wilson instituted a prohibition to save grain for food for the soldiers. The manufacturing, importing, and selling of alcohol were mostly abolished. In the United States, however, the Woodrow Wilson presidency submitted the 18th Amendment for state ratification on January 16, 1919, which resulted in the support of 3/4 of states just after 11 months. As a result, on January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment officially prohibited all alcohol. As it says on the 18th Amendment on the slide, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. And that is the prohibition instituted in America from 1920 to 1933. Now I'm going to talk about how bootleggers, speakeasies, and organized crime shaped the 1920s. I'd like to start off by talking about bootleggers. Bootleggers are people who produce, transport, and or sell alcohol, which means they basically just break the law. Now, it wasn't illegal to drink, but in order to drink, where were you going to get the alcohol? From bootleggers. In order to understand bootleggers, you need to understand this. Prohibition was not enforced with success, so bootlegging was relatively easy. But where did they get the alcohol that they transported, produced, and sold? Bootleggers smuggled alcohol through the Canadian and Mexican borders and through ships from Cuba and Bahamas. How is this possible from Canada if Canada had prohibition as well? Well, the thing is, Canada's prohibition was ending throughout the 1920s. In 1921, the British Columbian and Yukon governments sold alcohol through government stores. In 1923, the Manitoba governments began selling alcohol. In 1924, the Albertan and Saskatchewan government sells alcohol. In 1925, Newfoundland governments sell alcohol. And in 1927, the Ontarian and New Brunswick governments sell alcohol. So it was very much legal from a Canadian standpoint to allow American bootleggers to produce alcohol and transport it to America. Bootleggers would also do this using high-speed ships to smuggle alcohol into America after loading alcohol from sea. And their high-powered crafts would also outrace U.S. Coast Guard ships, so they would never be caught. To store the alcohol, bootleggers would buy concealed distilleries and breweries where they could transport and hide their alcohol. On top of all this, common people could produce their own liquor from non-alcoholic dehydrated grape juice fermented into wine. They could get whiskey from the doctor's office and drugstore with either real or forged prescriptions, and they could drink alcohol and wine for religious purposes, so many people became religious all of a sudden. Americans would also produce their own alcohol from hidden illegal stills in their households. Now that I've covered the production of alcohol, where's the demand and supply? Speakeasies. In order to distribute alcohol and liquor, bootleggers created speakeasies to supply their alcohol. Speakeasies were underground illegal institutions where people needed a password of some sort to get in. The thing is, everyone knew about speakeasies, even the cops, but we'll see their reaction to speakeasies later. In speakeasies, you had jazz, which was the new sound and inventive sound of the 20s. You had immense partying that seemed to go on all night long. You had flappers, which were new, young, and independent women that rejected the old civility and expressed themselves wildly and awesomely. And above all else, you had the booze. The speakeasies was the place to go to have a drink. Altogether, these four factors formed the Roaring Twenties. Failure of Prohibition, the rise of bootlegging, and the rise of speakeasies led to the creation of organized crime. This history video will explain the crime situation perfectly.
But the eradication of a corporate structure for alcohol production and distribution left a huge opportunity for a large-scale, organized, and insanely profitable black market. Existing small-time street gangs took advantage, quickly evolving into vast, bootlegging criminal enterprises. They employed everyone from warehouse workers to truck drivers to accountants. Gang leaders would bribe politicians, cops, even the Prohibition agents themselves, nicknamed Prohis, to ensure their businesses ran smoothly. Some relied on rum running, illegally importing liquor from other countries and storing it in warehouses across the U.S. Sometimes they would simply distill liquor in private homes. Other gangsters bought abandoned breweries and operated them in secret. They worked in the shadows, but one part of the business was very public: the violence. Gangs fought for territory in the streets of major U.S. cities. Chicago was especially violent. 729 people were killed by gangs in Cook County alone during Prohibition. The most famous of these incidents was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. Men working for Al Capone, dressed as policemen, gunned down 7 rival members of Bugs Moran's gang against the wall of a parking garage. No one was ever charged for the crime. Realizing cooperation could lead to greater profits, many gangs agreed to treaties that allowed them to operate peacefully in their respective territories. Johnny Torrio attempted to organize the gangs in Chicago, with Al Capone as his right-hand man. When Torrio retired to Italy and handed the reins to his protege, Capone inherited a business pulling in more than $1 billion a year in today's terms. Charles Lucky Luciano organized the Italian and Jewish gangs in New York under Joe the Boss Masseria, before Luciano had Masseria killed in 1931, and had his successor, Salvatore Maranzano, killed the same year. Luciano went on to found the Commission, a national crime syndicate composed of New York's 5 mafia families and the controlling families in Chicago and Buffalo.
Prohibition was proving to be an awesome failure. This is because the enforcement of Prohibition wasn't working, as cops basically just gave up. The amount of gang violence and crime increased due to the organized crime as seen in the St. Valentine's Massacre, as explained in the video we just saw, and the Great Depression had just begun, so many people believed that the repeal of the law would create jobs and increase tax revenue to improve the economy. Overall, Prohibition lost all of its support and people wanted a change. However, following the 1920 election, President Herbert Hoover wouldn't repeal Prohibition to allow the experiment noble in motive to continue, mainly so he could arrest Al Capone. In 1932, Al Capone was arrested for tax evasion, and Hoover got what he wanted, but he didn't arrest Al Capone for Prohibition, so it was sort of like a 50-50. Finally, in 1933, the new president Franklin D. Roosevelt originally passed the Cullen-Harrison Act, which later that year, on December 5, 1933, Prohibition was repealed with the 21st Amendment federally, but it was still technically allowed under state and local laws like in Canada. But overall, Prohibition ended. So now we've finished the first 2 parts of this presentation. We've summarized what Prohibition is, and we've talked about how it shaped the 1920s. Now, I want to relate Prohibition to The Great Gatsby and explain how it's found throughout the novel and even how it shapes the story. The first connection The Great Gatsby has to Prohibition has to do with an event at the beginning when Tom, Nick, and Myrtle partied while drunk. After a full day of drinking, Tom lashes out at Myrtle, his mistress, by punching her and breaking her nose. It is this exact behavior that the WCTU and Datselt societies were trying to prevent with Prohibition, abusive men under the influence of alcohol. While this cause is just, the Prohibition clearly didn't make a difference because, as we saw, people were still drinking alcohol and men were still lashing out and acting out while drunk. Secondly, Gatsby is a bootlegger. Gatsby made all of his money from buying drugstores and selling alcohol over the counter. We learned about this method of bootlegging earlier in the presentation when I talked about how people could get forged or even sometimes real prescriptions from doctors where they'd get a ton of alcohol. So basically, Gatsby is essentially that doctor that would give alcohol across the counter. This means that if Gatsby wasn't a bootlegger, though, then the story wouldn't even be possible. Well, why is that? Well, without Gatsby making a ton of money as a bootlegger, he would never be able to buy the mansion across the bay from Daisy's house. It is because of his money made from bootlegging in this way that he is able to buy this mansion and give us a story. Thirdly, Gatsby's parties perfectly show the uselessness of prohibition. At his parties, there's tons of people with all sorts of jobs, lives, lifestyles, and characters that all come to drink and party. This shows how blatantly Gatsby's parties were breaking the law, but the effect of the Roaring Twenties totally eliminated the enforcement of prohibition. On top of this, Gatsby's house is essentially a public squeakeasy that never gets shut down. So really, all of his parties show how great the 20s were, but also how terrible the prohibition law was and how it didn't even matter. Fourthly, you have the speakeasy scene. This scene perfectly describes the failure of prohibition and represents the radical excitement and sort of I dare you to break the law kind of attitude. In this scene, we see the secrecy of the speakeasy so it isn't shut down. We see the drinking offered at the bar illegally and how much drinking there really is. We see that bootleggers like Gatsby made the speakeasy to hide and provide all the alcohol. And we see the failure of law enforcement in ways that is quite amazing. Now I'd like to take a minute to watch the video.
He keeps his mouth shut or he doesn't get a penny.
We'll talk about that later.
Eyeballs, Mr. Gatsby.
Eyeballs it is. All right, take care of my friend. See these faces? He's the next heavyweight champion.
They're not respect to you,
Come on, you're under arrest. You be careful now. You're turning into a real jazz house, Commissioner.
As we saw in the video, prohibition was completely non-existent, and that's all you have to say about that. Lastly, the downfall of Gatsby is brought about when his true self, his bootlegging and organized crime self, is brought out by Tom. Gatsby tries to get Daisy to tell Tom she never loved him and that they will live together. Tom, with his pride and intelligence, decides to reveal the true Gatsby to Daisy to show Daisy that she truly loves Tom. Tom succeeds and Gatsby loses it. He rages and goes bonkers, proving Tom's point that Gatsby is a bootlegger and a criminal breaking the law of prohibition. Daisy ends up crying and calling for Tom's security, leaving Gatsby all alone with his love. Overall, it's prohibition that brings Gatsby's hopes with Daisy down. The context that Gatsby is a bootlegger and involved with organized crime illegally selling, transporting, and producing alcohol effectively destroys his reputation. He is no longer the desirable love for Daisy. Everything that Gatsby made, the mansion, the shirts, the money, all has no value because it's all dirty money and possession gained from the breaking of prohibition. And so, it's prohibition that causes the downfall of Gatsby's hopes and dreams and that moves the green light even further away. As a final summarization of prohibition, I have created this timeline that covers all the key points that I've discussed throughout the presentation. However, I will only cover the most important. In 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement was formed, and in 1875 and 1876, the Dominion Alliances for the Total Suppression of the Liquor Traffic was formed in Canada. In 1878, the Canada Temperance Act was passed, and in 1919, the 18th Amendment was submitted for state ratification on January 16th, which eventually led to the 18th Amendment becoming active on January 17th, prohibiting alcohol. In 1929, Herbert Hoover was inaugurated and did not repeal prohibition because he wanted to catch Al Capone. In 1932, Al Capone was sentenced to 11 years in prison due to tax evasion. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt was inaugurated, and he passed the Cullen-Harrison Act permitting alcohol, which eventually led to prohibition being repealed federally by the 21st Amendment. Finally, Prince Edward Island was the final province to ban prohibition. Thanks for listening to my presentation. It was really fun. I hope you learned something about prohibition. And if you have any questions, please email me at that email on the screen. Thanks so much.